Today, I want to talk to you about the bony pelvis. Some people simplify the complicated anatomy that is associated with the pelvis, but I think some people have simplified it to the point that it's actually making learning the necessary anatomy more complicated. These bones are being referred to by some as the hip bones or innominate bones, which is just Latin for unnamed. And whilst that simplifies the bony anatomy, it makes learning some of the landmarks quite hard. They become weirdly named structures rather than intuitively named. The hip bone is actually made up of 3 bones that join together over the first 20 years of your life. Whilst everybody is probably aware that this lower front area is called the pubic region or the pubic bone, the other 2 names are not quite so common. This bone towards the top is called the ilium. And this lower bone is called the ischium. These names become important when we look at the landmarks that some people are expected to know. First, let's deal with these 2 lumps here. Some people are taught that these are the sit bones. Their proper name is the ischial tuberosities, and that only makes sense if you know that that bone is the ischium and not the hip bone. This joint is called the SI joint. It's where the sacrum meets the ilium. That is where the S and the I come from. If you are taught that as the hip bone, then it's difficult to understand why it's called the SI joint. For the next set of landmarks, we need to understand a bit more about anatomical language. Everything in anatomy is described from the anatomical position that you can see here. And we have the terms superior and inferior that are relative. The rib cage is superior to the pelvis, but the pelvis is superior to the knee. Anterior is towards the front of the body and posterior to the back. Anatomical language is also quite frugal. Although we have long terms, every word is there for a reason. Next, we move to the ilium, and there are a number of landmarks here that really need you to know that this bone is called the ilium to make any sense at all. This brings us to 3 landmarks that are taught to many professions. The first one is this, the ASIS, or ASIS, or the anterior superior iliac spine, the headlight of the pelvis. Anterior, because it's towards the front of the body. But remember, it's a frugal language. If we've used the anterior, then it's because there's also a posterior one. And we can see this on the back of the pelvis. And we can see that here. This lump is the posterior superior iliac spine. And back to the front, we have the ASIS. The second word there is superior. Again, we wouldn't be using that word if there wasn't also an inferior one. And this lower lump here is the anterior inferior iliac spine. And despite what you've been told, it's not really a pleasant sensation when somebody tries to palpate that. Hopefully, you can see that if you've been taught that this bone is just called the hip bone, then a lot of these landmark names don't make sense. If you use the proper names for the bones of the pelvis, then you can work out the names of these landmarks and have a more thorough understanding.